Have you ever noticed that when something in your life feels unfinished, your mind keeps returning to it? You might finish your workday, put your phone away, and try to relax, yet one unanswered message, one unresolved conversation, or one incomplete task keeps appearing in your thoughts. You are not necessarily overthinking. Your brain may simply be reacting to something psychologists call the need for closure. Imagine a simple stick figure sitting at a desk. Everything around him is complete. His coffee is finished. His laptop is closed. His work is done. But on the screen, one small task remains unfinished. The stick figure walks away, but a thought bubble follows him. He goes to dinner, and the thought is still there. He lies in bed, and somehow that tiny unfinished task has become the loudest thing in his mind. This happens because your brain naturally prefers completed patterns. When something remains unresolved, the mind continues to treat it as mentally important. It is almost as if your brain leaves a small tab open in the background, waiting for an answer. One of the most famous psychological findings connected to this idea comes from psychologist Zeigarnik. Researchers noticed that waiters often remembered unpaid orders better than orders that had already been completed. This led to the discovery of what became known as the Zeigarnik Effect. Unfinished or interrupted tasks can remain more active in memory than completed ones. But there is something important to understand. This does not mean your brain is permanently obsessed with every unfinished task. The effect depends on the situation, your level of involvement, emotional importance, and whether you believe the task can actually be completed. In other words, the mind is not simply saying, everything must be finished. It is constantly evaluating what still requires attention. Picture another stick figure receiving a message from someone important. The message says, "We need to talk." That is all. No explanation. No context. No answer. Suddenly, the stick figure starts imagining possibilities. Did I do something wrong? Is something bad happening? Are they angry? What does this mean? Notice what happened. The person has almost no information, yet the brain immediately begins trying to complete the missing information. This is where uncertainty becomes psychologically powerful. When information is incomplete, the brain often tries to reduce the gap by generating possibilities. Sometimes those possibilities are accurate. Sometimes they are completely wrong. The important point is that the brain dislikes leaving a question unanswered. This is also why suspense works so well in movies and stories. A character opens a mysterious door, but the camera cuts away before we see what is inside. Your attention becomes locked onto the missing information. The story has created an open loop. Now imagine the same principle in everyday life. You are scrolling through your phone and see a notification from someone, but you do not open it. You tell yourself you will check it later. 10 minutes pass. You check your phone again. Nothing. Your mind returns to the notification. Not because the notification is necessarily important, but because it represents incomplete information. The same thing can happen with conversations. Someone says something unusual and then changes the subject. You may continue thinking about what they meant hours later. You replay their words. You examine their tone. You create different explanations. The brain is attempting to close the psychological gap. And this explains something fascinating about human attention. Sometimes the things we remember most strongly are not the things we finished, but the things we left unresolved. Think about a television series that ends an episode with a major unanswered question. You may find yourself thinking about it during the day. You might even search for theories about what happens next. Now compare that with an episode where every storyline is perfectly resolved. You enjoy it, but there may be less reason to keep thinking about it afterward. The unresolved story remains mentally active because your brain has not received the ending it expected. But there is another side to this phenomenon. An unfinished task can sometimes increase motivation. Imagine a stick figure who starts writing an article. He completes half of it and stops. Later, when he returns to his desk, he may feel a surprisingly strong desire to continue. Why? Because the task has already entered his mental system. The unfinished goal remains accessible, making it easier to return to. This can actually be useful. Instead of forcing yourself to finish everything in one sitting, you can sometimes stop at a natural point where you already know what comes next. For example, if you are writing, you might stop after creating the opening of the next section. When you return later, you do not have to ask yourself, "Where do I start?" Your brain already has a direction. The unfinished task has become a bridge to the next session. But there is a danger. If you create too many open loops at the same time, your mind can become overloaded. Imagine a stick figure surrounded by floating circles. One circle says, reply to this message. Another says, finish the project. Another says, call someone. Another says, fix the problem. Another says, research that idea. Another says, remember to do something tomorrow. None of these circles disappear. The figure becomes mentally exhausted even while doing nothing physically demanding. This is one reason writing things down can feel surprisingly relieving. When you put an unfinished task onto a reliable external system, you no longer have to continuously remind yourself about it. You are essentially telling your brain, this is recorded. You do not need to keep holding it in active attention. The goal is not to finish everything immediately. The goal is to reduce unnecessary mental loops. This also explains why closure can feel emotionally satisfying. Think about a disagreement that ends without resolution. Even if the argument was small, you might continue replaying it. You imagine what you should have said. You imagine what the other person meant. You create different endings. Then one day, you finally have a clear conversation. Suddenly, your mind becomes quieter. The situation may not have ended exactly the way you wanted, but uncertainty has been reduced. Closure does not always mean getting the answer you hoped for. Sometimes closure simply means finally understanding what happened and accepting that there is nothing more you can do. This distinction is extremely important, because if you believe you can only move forward after receiving the perfect explanation from another person, you can become trapped waiting for an answer that may never come. Your brain wants completion. Reality does not always provide it. Sometimes you have to create your own psychological ending. Imagine a stick figure standing in front of a door. Behind the door is a situation from the past. He keeps staring at it, waiting for someone else to open it. Then he realizes something. He does not need the door to open. He can walk away. That is a different kind of closure. It is not about pretending that the past never happened. It is about recognizing that continuing to mentally revisit it will not necessarily produce new information. This is where understanding the psychology becomes useful. When you notice yourself repeatedly thinking about an unfinished task, unresolved conversation, or unanswered question, instead of immediately judging yourself as an overthinker, pause and ask a different question. What exactly is unfinished here? Maybe you need information. Maybe you need to make a decision. Maybe you need to take one small action. Or maybe there is nothing left to do, and your mind simply has not accepted that the situation is finished. Once you identify which one it is, you can respond more effectively. If an action is required, write down the next step. If information is required, decide how and when you will get it. If a decision is required, give yourself a deadline. And if nothing can actually be done, recognize that the remaining discomfort may be the mind searching for an ending that reality cannot provide. That awareness alone can change how you experience your thoughts. The brain is not designed to give every unanswered question equal attention. It constantly prioritizes what feels unfinished, important, emotionally meaningful, or unresolved. So the next time a tiny unfinished task suddenly occupies your entire mind, remember what may be happening beneath the surface. Your brain may simply be trying to complete a pattern. And once you understand that, you gain something valuable. Not control over every thought. Not the ability to shut your brain off, but the ability to recognize why certain thoughts keep returning and decide whether they actually deserve your attention. Because sometimes the most powerful way to quiet the mind is not to force the thought away. It is to understand what the mind is still waiting for.